Hi, welcome to the launch of the new digital domain. My name is Oscar Jonsson and I'm Academic Director of the Center for the Governance of Change. We are a research center who's researching emerging technologies and their profound social, economic, and political impact. There's a lot of people investigating change, but what's different now is the speed of change. Today, the world is moving at a breakneck pace. You all know, you're all familiar about Moore's law and the exponential increase in computation. Maybe you're even familiar with Metcalfe's law on the increasing effect of networks when they grow. Let me give you two examples of change. It took 75 years for the telephone to reach 50 million users, but it only took 1 year for WeChat to reach 50 million. It took 19 days for Pokemon Go to do it. ExxonMobil was the largest company in the world in 2012. Today, Netflix is bigger, even though in 2012 was around when Netflix started its subscription services. At the same time, something else is happening as well. We've seen the hollowing out of the middle class across the Western world for a long time. And in the US, the likelihood of you earning more than your parents has decreased from 92% if you were born in the 1940s to 50% if you were born in the 1980s, such as myself. To understand all of this change and how emerging technologies are reshaping the world as we know it, we at the Center has 9 different research projects, ranging from everything to the future of work, to what it means for higher education, to how artificial intelligence is impacting healthcare, to also the geopolitics of emerging technologies. All we do is to get a holistic understanding of how change is impacting the world, but most importantly, what governments and international institutions can do to govern this change. Today, we're launching the report, The New Digital Domain. For a long time, our ways of life has been migrating to the digital. Our works, our economies, our societies, and even our social interactions are today substantially digital. The pandemic has accelerated this. Vladimir Lenin said that there are decades which nothing happens, and then there are weeks in which decades happen. And the pandemic has been exactly those kind of weeks and those kind of months where decades of progress has happened to our economies, to our work, and this will live with us for many, many years to come. The theme of today is how the pandemic reshaped digital economy, geopolitics, the fracturing social contract. And for this report, we will have a discussion first with the authors, Edoardo Campanella, who's an economist, a future World Fellow to the Center, and also author of a book on the politics of nostalgia. Also, we're having Taylor Owen, who is director of the Center for Media, Technology and Democracy at McGill University, senior fellow at CIGI, also an author himself. And then, after they have presented the report, we will be joined by the Secretary of State for Global Spain, Manuel Muñiz, who's also previously a co-founder of the Center, a founder of the Center, and a dean for IE University School of Global and Public and Political Affairs. So first of all, I want to invite the authors, Edoardo and Taylor, to come and give your view, to tell us about what are the core contents of the report. I'm passing the floor over to you, Edoardo.
Hi, Oscar, and thanks a lot for organizing this event and inviting me to discuss the results of our report. The main message of the report is that COVID-19 doesn't change history, it simply accelerates existing trends. In the economic section of the report, we focus on 2 dimensions of the digital economy broadly defined and the social contract. And briefly discuss each of them, starting from the digital economy. The years before the COVID-19 outbreak were characterized by a widening technological gap and productivity gap between frontier and non-frontier firms. Only a handful of firms, the big tech, the Amazon, were truly mastering the fourth industrial revolution. The majority of the other firms were still stuck in the third industrial revolution. Let's be very clear, for the vast majority of companies, robotics, big data, artificial intelligence are not priority at all. Spain, where IB is based, and the same is true also for Italy, in these countries, more than 90% of companies are small and medium-sized, and very often they are run by a single family. So they usually lack the financial and organizational capacity to invest in certain technologies. The great lockdown provided tangible evidence of this gap. Only a number of different digital platforms provide customers with goods and services that were no longer available on traditional markets. The skyrocketing market performance of stocks like Netflix or Zoom was just a reminder of this gap. A few other companies, usually companies of large size like banks or multinational operating in traditional sector, during the lockdown, they tried to accelerate the adoption of digital technologies. Some of them more or less rapidly, more rapidly, other less rapidly. In some cases, the transition was successful. In other cases, not so successful. But the vast majority of companies were stuck to manage this transition. One of the results of it is going to be rising tension in the coming months and years between three actors. The leaders, the big tech, the Amazons, they will keep pushing forward the technological frontier. The adapters, like again, the corporation, will try to catch up. But the laggards that remain the majority of companies will risk to fall further behind. So, one of the creation in the digital economy, but also a widening technological gap between frontier and non-frontier companies. And here is the first input for Manuel, that I say hi to him. It's one of the messages that there are three leaders, there are these three actors, but there is a fourth one, that is politics, that can play an important role. Regulators will have to perform a complicated balancing act. On the one hand, they have to guarantee and create an innovation-friendly environment, but they also need to find a way to introduce smart and light regulations in disrupted sector in order to allow the laggards to adapt. Very briefly, one more minute and I'm done. The societal flip side of this technological gap was rising income inequality, particularly in the West. The most qualified were thriving in the system, whereas the middle class was slowly disappearing, with political consequences, because that led to the rise of populism in Europe and in the US. The pandemic has to some extent exacerbated inequalities and the labor market polarization, because only highly qualified people, workers, could work comfortably from home. Essential workers, like a bus driver, cashier in supermarket, they always had to show up at work. Poor people are usually have a poorer health condition, and so they are more vulnerable to the virus. So during the pandemic, we saw an exacerbation of these inequalities, and it's something can continue in the future. In fact, the most affected sectors by the pandemic are those where low-skilled and low-paid workers are concentrated. The only positive outcome so far of the pandemic is that people have rediscovered the importance and the value of expertise. So populists are having a hard time trying. And this is another input for Manuel, and I will stop here. Are we sure that this positive trend, political trend, will continue in the future, considering that the recovery will take a long time and many sectors realistically will never recover? Governments scale back their employment protection scheme, the number of unemployed will increase significantly. I stop here and I give the floor to Oscar.
No, thank you very much, Edo. We definitely hope for that. We're going to go straight over to Taylor to hear your reflections and the core of the report.
Yeah, thanks, Oscar, and it's great to be here. Welcome, hi from Canada. I think like Edoardo said, it's pretty clear the pandemic has hastened a series of restructurings that were happening in our global economic, political, and social systems. That's now kind of become a truism. And I think there's no case where this is more true, though, than in the digital domain. We've all en masse moved online with speed and urgency that never would have been imaginable beyond it 6 months ago. And as a result, I think there's been a real restructuring, a geopolitical restructuring that's fallen from that. And at the core of that is that the people who control and the organizations that control our digital infrastructure have gotten clearly more powerful. It's worth just pausing on that for a moment, I think. The five largest global tech firms are now worth $7 trillion, and they've doubled in value over the course of the pandemic in 6 months. So these were already the largest companies in the world, the fastest growing companies in the world, arguably the companies with the largest influence over our political, social, and economic systems, and they have now doubled in size. And this is part and parcel of what I think are some real fissures emerging in our global geopolitics as they relate to technology. And I want to identify three of them because I think they give us a lens through which we can talk about the nature of this global governance challenge, just how big it is, and how in some ways kind of intangible it is. A first fissure is around our technological infrastructure itself. Yes, there are five large American companies that dominate much of the world's digital infrastructure, everything from back-end telecom systems through to software layers and platforms. But there is also a competing infrastructure that is being developed and now exported by the Chinese state. These are two very different infrastructures that offer different value propositions to countries that adopt one over the other. And that conflict and whether a centralized global internet can survive the tension between those infrastructures is going to be one of the dominant geopolitical challenges of the next decade. There's no doubt about it. The second is fissures amongst the political context in which these infrastructure are being adopted by citizens. We are seeing increasing divides between democratic states, illiberal-leaning regimes, either that may have been democratizing on a path towards democracy up until recently. We're now seeing slip back to being a liberal, and full autocracies. And the way in which each of those countries use and adopt, both governments and citizens use and adopt these digital infrastructure are very consequential, and I think are leading to some path dependency towards a liberal governance. And as citizens of democratic countries who seek to expand democracies globally, this should be a real concern. And the final kind of fragmentation I think that exists here is around governance regimes. We're seeing a pretty clear divide that we talk about in the report between a U.S. governance infrastructure system for our digital infrastructure that is very firm-centric. It prioritizes the rights of companies to grow and scale globally over those of other actors in society. And that has been the dominant governance regime for the internet through its life. A second governance regime would be a much more state-centric view, which the Chinese government is promoting and exporting. And this puts the state in a position of power over users and companies, and where the benefits, both economic and in terms of social and political control, accrue. And a final, I think, this, particularly in a Spanish context, is worth thinking seriously about, is the EU governance framework that's emerging. And I would argue this is much more of a rights-based framework, where the rights of users are prioritized over either that of the firm or that of the state. So with those three tensions in place, and fragmentations in place in our global geopolitics, I would argue they all together present an urgent need for global democratic governance. If we don't figure out how to govern these tensions democratically, then I think the slide towards a liberal and even autocratic use of the technologies and monopolization of the technologies is a real risk. So as a sort of jumping off point for this conversation, and that I hope our report spurs, and for wider collaboration, I think we need to think seriously about what global governance of our digital infrastructure looks like, whether we have the right institutions at the moment to do it, and which countries and which actors within civil society in those countries are going to be a part of leading that new governance change. So I'll leave it at that, and look forward to discussing further.
I mean, to summarize, we're having big tech getting bigger, the precarious having more precarious. We see increasing geopolitical competition. And I'm super happy to be joined by someone who's not only thought a lot about this. You worked at Harvard, at Oxford, you have a PhD from Oxford, you've been a dean here at IE University, and you for a long time have been talking by all of these issues. And now you're even in government and tasked with solving the issues of global governance, of EU governance, of promoting how solutions to these questions across the world. So, first of all, warm welcome to you, Manuel Muñiz, Secretary of State for Global Spain. The first thing I want to ask you is really, what are your main takeaways of the reports? What are the main takeaways of the discussion? And then we're going to get a little bit more deeper into, how do we solve this and what can we do? So, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here and to be discussing this, and I want to thank the two authors, because it was a wonderful report, and thank you, Oscar, for coordinating the work. It is true that I now work in government at the foreign ministry, and I help coordinate the strategy effort within the foreign ministry. So a lot of our strategic thinking, our external action strategy, is based and around these things, and we try to address them. We're in the process here in Spain of producing a strategy on technology and global order that addresses the intersection of technology and diplomacy that maybe we can talk about more a little bit further down the conversation. But my main takeaway from the report, and it's not a small takeaway, because as you know, there's been an ongoing debate around the effects of COVID-19 on global politics. And there's been people I think there's a camp that basically says COVID will radically change the world. There's a group of people that would say, well, now actually the impact is not going to be that significant. And then there's a group of people that say, well, it's going to be a huge accelerator of prior trends. And we now fall, at least from our point of view at the MFA here, in this third camp, which is precisely where the report, I think, ends up landing. And I'm going to mention at least two areas where I see COVID being a huge accelerator. And they intertwine, and they're sort of, they weave quite naturally with some of the comments that have been made before. The first front, where we see this as an accelerator, is on the social fracture front. And this is not a small thing, because our diagnosis is that if there is one fundamental trend of the last 10 to 15 years in global politics, is the slow erosion and weakening of the international architecture of multilateral governance, and a very clear process of regression on individual freedoms and liberties, and a growing questioning of liberal democracy in places. That was, in fact, just said prior to our conversation. Now, what is causing that process to a large extent is this widening social gap, and this process of social fracture. So you mentioned at the beginning this idea of the hollowing out of the middle class, and the fact that the hollowing out of the middle class produces the hollowing out of the middle of our political spectrum, and it is that political polarization that is producing this international convulsion. So a major question is, what does COVID do to trends of social fracture? And what it seems to do is it seems to deepen them, because it has a very unequal impact within our societies. It impacts disproportionately people that are precariously employed. We know this from the preliminary evidence that we can see. It impacts single parent homes disproportionately. It widens the educational gap, particularly, affecting particularly households that have little access to digital tools, for example. So, households with lower income. So that's a big concern of ours, that as we exit this crisis, as we manage it and exit the crisis, hopefully in the coming months, this is done with a view of inclusion and trying to prevent some of the mistakes that I think were made in 2008, 2009 in the exit to the prior crisis. That was fairly unequal and definitely perceived as unequal by many of our citizens, and I think fed into this process of political polarization and others. If we don't do this in an inclusive way, I think our politics will worsen greatly in the next 10. Now, the second topic, and I want to be quick so that we can have a Q&A, but this is, I think, significant, is this crisis seems to accelerate the process of deglobalization, right? So it introduces an argument of national security and strategic autonomy to the process of supply chain shortening or reshoring or a reduction of interdependence, right? So we had supply chain challenges at the beginning of the crisis. Most of the countries in the world, particularly the ones that were hit first, like Italy and Spain, but also other European countries, we had supply challenges when it came to respirators and to protective equipment and others. So now to the general debate on the benefits of globalization, this whole security dimension has been added. So there's a debate in Europe: how does strategic autonomy look? How do we prevent, this? How do we build resilience into our supply chains moving forward? And the answer is basically going to be nearshoring or reshoring part of that production within the EU. How far that debate goes, I think will have a big impact on globalization trends and on global trade trends. There's a dimension to this that has also been mentioned, and I'll finish on this, which is the digital dependency dimension, right? So, when you're sitting in Europe and you look at the state of innovation, and this was mentioned in the report, by the way, you had some very interesting statistics on how Europe was lagging behind on AI startups, on large technology companies, on entrepreneurship, in fact, in the tech space quite generally. But when you look at the tech space, the most competitive 5G providers are not European still, although we do have a few that are European, and they're getting there, but they're still not the most competitive in terms of price and others. The operating systems of our phones are not European. The geolocation services, until we have Galileo up and running, are not European. The cloud is not European. I think we have to have a serious debate about how digital sovereignty and autonomy looks like. And this crisis is, again, a big accelerator for that debate, because a lot of our activity, economic, social, etc., was moved to the digital domain. So actually in the report you cite this study by McKinsey, which basically says in the past couple of months we've moved forward 5 years worth of digitalization, right? So it makes this problem more acute. So my main takeaway from the report would be that this is a big accelerator, and it raises these issues that were already on the agenda, but it makes them even more acute.
Yeah, no, and just from where you ended on European digital sovereignty, let's push a little bit further, because I think one of the figures that scared me the most, which I didn't see until we were done with the report, but I saw it after, and that said that none of the top 40 European companies were born the last 40 years. So all of Europe's biggest companies are the old one, whereas if you look in China and you look in the US, you have the big tech giants. The other one is a report from the European Industry Board saying that Europe is lagging the US around 3 years in 4G implementation, not only to talk about 5G, looks about the same for China. The example we use in the report is that actually two private companies, Google and Apple, decided which protocols were going to be used for 3.2 billion smartphones, which is basically all of Europe.
Sure.
The German government, the British government, two of the biggest European nations, couldn't implement their own solutions, which have their problem, of course, or not. But this really, for me, this underlines the power distribution of today, where the large European governments have a really hard time to being in actors, because in the digital space, we don't own the companies, we don't set the rule for the companies. And this seems to be something that the European Commission have started to recognize in strategies and in words. But how do we get from there to results? And what worries you the most, and what are the solutions?
So there's a number of pieces to this debate, and they're all very interesting and very complex, right? So the first is sort of the geopolitics of technology. How is this distributed globally, and how do we make sure that Europe doesn't lose the wave of innovation and falls behind on the key technologies where we know, as Edo Campanella was just saying, the technologies and the firms that are concentrating productivity growth, competitiveness, high-paying jobs, etc. Now, the answer to that, in my mind, is complex, but there are answers to this. So I would argue we need to complete the digital single market in Europe. So we need to have a large market that is properly regulated as a single market, and that companies that operate in that market don't have to go, jump over, 20-odd regulatory hurdles and others. That gives your startups scalability, which is a key ingredient of a healthy startup entrepreneurial ecosystem. But there are other things, right? So we need to make sure that our transfer mechanisms and our universities and research centers are connected to the entrepreneurship world. And I think this has to be one of the pillars of our academic and research activity, our applied research activity in Europe. And I don't think this is as well crafted as it is in the States and China, that connection. I think we need to deepen our venture capital world and others. So there's a regulatory, financial, sort of academic and research piece to this puzzle. But there's no reason, I don't see any structural reason why Europe shouldn't be able to lead in these technologies. We clearly have the human capital, we have the infrastructure, we have the depth of markets and the scale. We just need to coordinate all of these pieces better. But if we lose this race, I would be very concerned, because it's like losing the industrial revolution wave, right? It's going to mean stagnant wages and not being competitive. It also means not developing the next generation of strategic industry. So there's a security and foreign policy dimension, because what we're seeing is that the new security landscape is basically the data and technology landscape, right? So you don't want to fall behind there. But there are other issues with tech, and I'm just going to name them very quickly. And this goes to the point of the European model that was just mentioned, right? Because there are downsides to this transition to the digital economy and world. The first, I would say, has to do with taxation. So we have a big challenge taxing digital companies. So we need to come up with a way of retaining fiscal traction over digital activities. And this is a must. So these processes have to go hand in hand. You grow and you're competitive, but at the same time you do this in a just and equitable way, and taxation is one of the ways. There's a competition challenge. So these markets are oligopolistic, if not monopolistic, in many senses. In fact, what was mentioned about the concentration of productivity growth in frontier firms is a clear manifestation of an oligopolistic force, right? Not seeing productivity diffusion in digital markets is a sign that you have these winner-takes-all markets in these places. So those are two. The third, I would argue, has to do with the geographic location of innovation. So we've seen huge concentrations geographically in clusters of knowledge and of transfer and of entrepreneurship. So, around 90% of all jobs created in the tech space in the States in the last 15 years were concentrated in 5 cities. So this means that the rest of the country saw no growth in the most competitive and high-paying types of jobs. And I think that for Europe is an issue and should be an issue, because it builds unequal societies. It diminishes social mobility because it links it very strongly with geographic location. Sometimes it's even, according to some studies that I've read, it's even tough for people to move to these cities in the first place because of the cost of actually settling and because of the role of real estate cost. This is a real barrier for social mobility. And I would argue the fourth issue, so on this front, we just need to figure out a way to distribute economic opportunity and growth. So this process of innovation needs to be intermediated by policy. And I'm not sure if this will happen in the US naturally, but it will. I think it has to happen in Europe. So we're really thinking about, just to give you an example, we just presented the candidacy of León, which is one of the capital of our provinces here in Spain, to host the EU Cyber Center. And this is, I think this is a good practice, that we try to build these clusters in places different to Madrid, Barcelona, London, Paris, Berlin, or whatever it is. And then the fourth and final issue, and this is, I think this is slightly deeper, is on the rights front. So, and the reference to the European model and having this rights-based approach to tech, which is fundamentally built around privacy, fundamentally. I mean, there are others, but if I would have to point to a single right, it would be who owns the data that is produced and who gets to exploit the data. And this is not just an economics question about rents on maybe a factor of production or an asset that people are producing that is exploitable. But because of our knowledge of neuroscience and behavioral sciences, how we perimeter the right to privacy will, to a large extent, determine how corporations or states can nudge and push people towards certain behavior. So this goes beyond surveillance. I mean, it's about protecting agency, and this is built around these rights. So there's a huge debate to be had there, and I think Europe, through GDPR, and there'll be an AI strategy and an AI regulation that is also emerging at the Commission, will have to build a framework that guarantees people's privacy and hence people's freedom. So it's not a small thing. Yeah. So I would mention those things as things that are on the agenda that can and should be done.
The thing that worries me, that I have a hard time understanding, is that not only are the big tech companies big, but they are also in a sense have become infrastructure, which makes it very, very hard for, let's say, European companies to try and establish themselves. Because if you have to go to App Store, you have to abide by the rules of Apple, by the way they're setting it. If you want to sell books, you have to abide by the rules of Amazon, otherwise you won't reach out with it. And these companies are, if you take Facebook, for instance, if we take Google, they are information networks whose business models is being manipulated for profit. Not only are they being manipulated for profit, they're trying to gather as much data as possible to be able to know as much as possible about you to get effective ads. That's basically the concept. And now they become so vast that they are the infrastructure through which we access the internet. I mean, very seldom do we go and search for something anymore. We see it through Facebook, through Twitter, through YouTube, for instance, is what we see our content. So is there any hope for Europe to even regulate this? And a second question, a report that we launched this spring, European Tech Insights, which is a survey attitude to see how Europeans feel and think about technological change. In it, we found that both Europeans, Americans, and Chinese asked on the question, why doesn't EU do better in innovation? The answer was the EU is perceived too much regulation. It's too much. It's too burdensome to get there. So, on the one hand, we need to regulate more. How do we do it? On the other hand, isn't the problem that we're regulating too much?
Sure. Well, two very good questions and complex. On the platform dimension and the infrastructure dimension, you have there's the work that has been done by Professor Frey at Oxford, Carl Frey, who has argued that some of these companies, effectively, they're the market. They're market makers, right? And we should try to make them public markets, right? So they should be readily accessible to people, and you should be able to access their service. We do this all the time, by the way. I mean, if you think about how telco companies are obliged to have their network be accessed by other companies, and we've done this, and we access their radio towers, and we allow part of that bandwidth to be used by competitors, even though there's an original company that set up the infrastructure. I think there are models for this. In some instances, in fact, the infrastructure itself is made public. In others, it's kept private, but they're obliged by law to allow others to operate within the platform. But I think this will be necessary on many, many fronts, because if not, the difficulty of access, the scale and network effects will be so dominant that they will force, they will keep players out of those markets. I mean, just imagine if a private company could own all of the transportation infrastructure, right, in that country. It would be the unavoidable actor in that market for anything that had to do with the movement of goods and services. So we cannot allow our data infrastructure to serve as a limit to people operating in data in adjacent fields or businesses, right? I think it would be really crippling to innovation. So I think this is something that we need to keep our eye on. By the way, very interesting work also, and I recommend a book titled Radical Markets on this by an American economist that has looked precisely at how these markets, unless they're properly regulated, they can serve as a limitation to others accessing. On the European front and the regulatory front, and by the way, let me make an additional comment on this, which is I think the argument could be made that some of these very large data and digital companies are too large, and many people are making the argument. So on top of having their infrastructure be publicly accessible, some of them might have to be broken up. I mean, and this is the notion that I was mentioning before of updating our competition policy, right? I mean, we have to think about what the implications are, because these firms are not charging a price nominally for many of the services. Our traditional antitrust regulation is a bit sort of blindsided by their activity, but at the end, if you look at the spirit of the regulation of antitrust, they operate in oligopolistic ways in many of these markets. So that, I think that's something that that already antitrust authorities, particularly in the US and Europe, are looking into. Now, on the regulatory front, I think too much regulation is an issue for innovation, but I don't think that what's preventing Europe from leading in these sectors is an excess of regulation, except on the digital single market front. So we need to perfect the single market, but this does not undo, I think, any of the arguments in favor of proper taxation, of proper regulation of privacy, of the incentivizing of regional development of tech hubs. I think all of those things can be done without hindering our capacity and our competitiveness in the innovation space. And even if they did, I think that would be a cost, that would be a price in competitiveness that we should be willing to pay. Because if this sector remains as unregulated and as disintermediated as it is right now, I think its impact on employment, on income generation and distribution, on the capacity of states to tax economic activity, all of these things will be so significant, the impact will be so significant that it will spill over into our politics, and that will break our politics, and our politics will break our markets, right? So, and our corporations. And I think that's it's a cost that it's too high for us to bear. So we need to build equity and sustainability into the digital economy. We need a new social contract, right, for the digital era.
We definitely do. No, and on public good and politics breaking and breaking the markets, I think one of the things connected is really what should be a public good is the information domain. We're seeing, as I described, the information domain basically being run by a network whose business models is manipulating this network for profit, and algorithms premiering the most emotional, the most activating content. How can we make the information space a public good again? And how worried are you about an epistemological crisis, really, a crisis of how do we know what we know?
Well, I think you and I have I think exchanged ideas on this in the past. I'm quite concerned about the health of our public debate, and I'm quite concerned about the impact of two phenomena that are basically, they go hand in hand, right? One is the rise of social networks as structures of the public debate, as facilitators and structures of the public debate, which to a large extent they have become, because a lot of people are now consuming news and consuming information directly through these networks. So the mediation of these networks and their algorithms are affecting what people read and what information they access. And these networks are irresponsible actors in the media space from the point of view that they're not liable for the content they distribute. And I mean, this is not like a qualitative assessment. It's not an opinion. I mean, they're literally not liable legally, formally, for the content they distribute. This is so because they're regulated and conceived as platforms, and this happens in the US, and platforms are simply, the argument is they're just allowing people to share content, so they have no editorial capacity, which in fact could be questioned given the fact that the algorithms do prioritize content and they do filter content, so you're in fact altering what people see. It's not just a pure feed of what other people are sharing on their walls and the people that you're following, right? There's also an intermediation in the fact that they recommend certain content and they recommend people to follow. So I mean, the whole process is in fact heavily affected by that algorithm. To add another layer of controversy to this process, the algorithm is tailored in a way that seeks to engage attention, as you just mentioned. So there's in fact a profit motive, and there's in fact a clear principle that is guiding how that algorithm mediates and edits in the editorial, in the journalistic sense, content. Now, this first phenomena is accompanied by another, which is a bit unfortunate, which is these social platforms are funded through fundamentally publicity and ads, and which they're taking away from traditional media providers, which are less capable of targeting those ads to people. So basically they have managed to dismantle the funding model of traditional media. So you have at the same time the emergence of these giants, irresponsible giants in the communication space, and at the same time the weakening and the collapse of the traditional structures of the public debate, which had journalistic, editorial principles, veracity and fact-checking principles behind their coverage. Now, the combination of these two processes has really produced a public debate that is more fragile and that is more open to manipulation and disinformation. And now we don't know, we simply do not know how to sustain a healthy public debate without a set of truthful sources of information. Maybe there's a way, maybe we're simply in a transition where layers of quality and rigor will be built into the social media landscape, and the traditional forms will simply be outdated. So I'm not claiming that we have to go back, to these old models, but the new ones, as they are built right now, are, in my mind, insufficient, and this is creating problems for us, because what we're seeing in cyberspace is these campaigns to delegitimize our intermediation institutions, so our political parties, our political leaders, our business leaders, our intellectual leaders, our academic institutions, because it's through the attack on their legitimacy that you get system weakening and system erosion, right? A system collapse, possibly. So what you said, I mean, these are anti-enlightened, right? They're unenlightened motives and motivations for these campaigns. And these things are clearly connected. There's an additional point that I think is of interest, which is you have these external actors that are pushing this disinformation into our public debate. But at the same time, because of this erosion of our middle class and this growing discontent with the system, you now have these groups within our society that are far more willing to consume this information and to give it credit. Because the totality of the architecture, the information architecture and the policy crafting architecture is tainted by the unequal outcome of the last 30 to 40 years in terms of economic growth and opportunity, right? So it's one of these places where the external and the internal combine.
Exactly. No, and I think that's our really, really good and important words to end it with. And I think that, as you're saying, I think we need to look at it to two separate lenses. One is there's a fixed system which we have, I mean, in terms of, both in redistribution, but also in terms of the information landscape. We need to fix that, but we also need to think about how to stop foreign actors from going at it. But that's a debate for another time. I want to bring back my co-authors for the report, Edo and Taylor, back into the discussion, and hear a little bit on. We end on a number of recommendations and really try to how to solve this. So, let me pass it back to you, Taylor, first. Your time to go first.
Sure. I was really struck by that conversation, first of all. I think you zeroed in on some of the core governance challenges we have at the center of the space right now. I think that was a really thoughtful conversation. To me, I keep coming back to whether we have the right institutional frameworks to deal with a new set of challenges. our both domestic and global governance institutions were built for a different set of problems and a different set of global structures. They were built for a tangible economy where the flow of goods and services was the central thing that needed to be regulated in the global economy. And now we're dealing with an intangible economy where data and assets and algorithms and IP are what need to be protected and governed. They dealt with harms from physical conflict and borders between states, when now we know that the incitement to violence and the fragmentation of society and polarization are occurring in a different space, largely driven by the digital domain and the architecture that governs it. So to me, if we're looking at where we go with this, I think it's this paired governance conversation we need to have. One is domestically, how are we ensuring that either our current legal and regulatory regimes, this is in democracies I'm talking about, are adapted and applied to the digital domain? And if they can't be, or if they're insufficient, then I think we need to think about new domestic regulations and laws. And that's obviously happening in democracies around the world as we speak. But a second layer is how those countries who are engaging in this governance conversation can learn from each other and coordinate with one another. As much as we might like to think it's the case, I don't think Spain or Canada alone are going to have the market power and regulatory power to fundamentally change the behavior of what are global companies. However, working together, perhaps with a network of other countries, we all of a sudden can, one, learn from each other, and I think there's a series of policy iterations that need to happen here. When Germany tries NetzDG, for example, we all know there were positive and negative impacts of that, and now Canada, updating our hate speech law, can learn from that, right? So I think there's a really important information sharing function, but there's also just a market size function too, where like-minded countries banding together to figure out how to democratically govern our digital domain can have some real sway if they work together. And when I look at the international institutions we currently have, I do not see the natural home for that conversation. So globally, I think we need to think very seriously about whether we have the right institutions for democratic governments to collaborate and work together on governing this set of challenges we've been talking about.
Thank you very much, Taylor. No, and I think that some of the issues you have highlighted are some of the key ones. I mean, the European Union is one of the world's biggest markets, and like the biggest markets, and together with like-minded democratic countries who see this as a problem, you could actually use a lot of soft power to reach that legislation. I forgot to mention in the beginning, of course, for all of those of you listening and wondering, the report is available at cgc.ie.edu. And there you find our other reports as well. I'm going to pass it straight over to you, Edo, your reflections and your takeaways from this discussion.
Yes, thanks a lot. It was a fantastic conversation, and I think Manuel already highlighted some of the conclusions that we reach in the report in terms of policy recommendation. So for sure it's important to tax more and fairly high tech and to avoid tax evasion at the global level. Government needs to invest in education to allow the low skilled to have better chances and opportunities in today's labor market. And then there is the issue, for instance, of essential workers that played a key role during the pandemic, are both employed in the traditional sector and in the gig economy, but they are poorly treated both in terms of remuneration and in terms of social security. So for sure we need to take care of them. There is something I pick up from conversation. It's interesting his example of Leon and the geography of innovation. One of the one of the conclusion in the report that we make is that the pandemic is actually providing us with a great opportunity to reduce the regional divides that are of populism. We talk about the potential for changing the traditional urban hierarchies between the core and the periphery that have been predominant in the West since the first industrial revolution. The pandemic allowed us understand, change our perception of distance and show us that it is possible to live and work very far away from our workplace. Clearly, this is a prerogative of high-skilled people because only around 35% of the workforce can work from home in an effective way. But if people move from core cities like Madrid or London or San Francisco, not necessarily to the countryside, but to small, medium-sized towns, they can revive the local economy, and they can help filling the regional divide and the gap that we saw before the outbreak of the crisis. So I think the Lyon example is a very interesting one, and I hope governments will try to invest in smart policies to accelerate this transition away from large urban center. If I may, Oscar, I have two questions for Manuel as a reaction to his speech. What can I?
Yeah, go on. We'll see if we can get him back. Go on, post the questions.
Sorry. So when we talk about the leaders of the system, we focus. So okay, when we talk about the Manuel, sorry, there is an issue. Most governments, when it comes to technology, most governments want to attract Googles or Amazon and to have these tech giants operating in their economies. And so all the attention is on how to attract them and make sure that you have your own Googles and your own Amazon. But the problem, in my opinion, is that we very often forget about the non-frontier firms. So we need to find ways to make them grow and make them more competitive. So I was wondering if you have a view on how to facilitate that process. And I will just stop with one question.
Thank you. Well, I'll try to answer this, and then I have to shoot off. But I'll finish the panel from my office. But I think this is a key question, because if you look at the economic structure in most of our countries, actually frontier firms, they're very significant when it comes to innovation and innovation pickup, but they're not that large in terms of employment generation. So it's upwards of I think in 80-90% of our employment here in Spain is basically procured by SMEs, right? So it's the SME sector that we need to make sure basically absorbs these technologies. I think the competition issue is one of the tools to do this. That's why I was mentioning before that I think there has to be a recalibration of this policy, because as long as they remain so large and so capable of incorporating these technologies, we're only going to see these companies grow larger and larger. And in fact, we've seen them jump to adjacent markets very quickly, to markets where in principle, to start off with, they shouldn't have any particular competitive advantage except the fact that they have these data and network effects. So I think that's one of the ways. And then I think there's fiscal incentives to innovation that can be approved specifically for SMEs. There's a lot that the private sector itself can do. So there are many initiatives here by the Chamber of Commerce, by the Business Association, where what they're trying to do is they're trying to get medium and small-sized companies to work together in clusters, sometimes to liaise with larger corporations to implement technology and incorporate technology. Many times we think that this issue of technological pickup is linked to funding and finance. Our findings from here and our perception is that in fact it has a lot to do with human capital, knowledge, and the processes of incorporating these technologies into their processes and their operations. So a lot can be done through support on knowledge, on technology implementation, and others. So I think it's a mix of things. Finally, I'd like to say something on this, which I think is vital, which is initiatives of corporate venture and having this culture within our SMEs of being in touch, if not having a corporate venture operation of their own, at the very least be very connected to these centers of transfer. I think there's a real misconception about entrepreneurship, which is you start something in your garage and then a few years later this is Apple. I mean, in most instances, smaller startups get bought up by SMEs or larger corporations, and what they do is they transform these companies as part of their business. So I think this idea of having these SMEs in contact with the entrepreneurial ecosystem is absolutely vital for these SMEs to both pick up tech and for that entrepreneurial ecosystem to do very, very well. I mean, it's astonishing. It's upwards of 80% of startups end up being bought up by larger companies, rather than scaling and becoming these huge multinationals that standalone companies. So I think that needs to be present in the way that we tackle this from a policy and strategy perspective.
Yeah, no, and to really emphasize the divide we're standing in front of, I think one of the things in January, Apple surpassed the value of DAX 30, which is Germany's 30 most valuable companies. And Germany is the biggest economy in Europe. So having one of these companies on the one hand is, of course, a really big gain economically, but then on the other hand, as you're saying, these companies run some data, they run some algorithms rather than physical labor. And at some point, we need to think of, what do we do with labor? What do we do with redistribution? And this is really a very good segue to say that today's report is the soft launch of a bigger research project that we're kicking off at the center. With the coming years, we will dig into all of these aspects that we talked about today, about the digital economy, about the fracturing social contract, about power in the digital era, and about data privacy, which underlines all of this transformation. So, to the public, thank you very much for joining us. Manu, thank you very much for joining us physically, and Edo and Taylor, thank you very much for joining us virtually. So, the report is at cgc.ie.edu, and we'll be in touch. Thank you very much.